Welcome back to Beyond Well Science. I'm Sheila Hamilton, and particularly excited to be speaking with Reggie Lee from the Hearing Voices Network. He is expanding the Hearing Voices Network here in the Northwest, and he's here today to talk to us a little bit about his path to hearing voices. Hi, Reggie. It's good to speak with you.
Hi.
Would you tell me what was happening in 2012 for you when you were working as a cook?
So for me, I had a long history of drug and alcohol abuse, and I guess my perception around it is that I had a long history of abuse, and I found drugs and alcohol to kind of soothe, my body and give me a sense of comfort for once. And this went on for me for about 7 years of using drugs and alcohol, and then I decided, I should probably just give this a break, and I found a book on Buddhism and just felt really intrigued by it, and I got sober on my own, and I started meditating a lot. I had previously been meditating since about the 7th grade, but fully, engaged in that, and all of the stuff that I was suppressing with drugs and alcohol, for me, reemerged in the framework of hearing voices and having visions, and how that presented itself for me was at first I just had a voice that was narrating what I was doing, and I wasn't very startled by it. I just thought it was kind of odd. And I was, cooking, and things just started to get a little altered. I started to have a harder time keeping up with the pace of cooking, and things started to get really confusing for me, and the voice went from just narrating what was going on to something kind of turned a little bit, and things started to get a little menacing and not so nice, and I started to progressively get more and more terrified of my experience, and I remember looking up Buddhist centers to go live at. I told my dad that I'd probably never see him again.
Oh, no.
And, that was probably quite the thing for him to hear, and I found myself pretty lost, and at a certain point, I got to the point where I felt like my perception at the time was that a demon was taking over my body, and I couldn't do anything about it, and I was trying, every meditation technique I could to ease my pain, and I remember picking up a book from a gentleman named Eckhart Tolle about spiritual awakening, and I remember the words on the page falling off.
Oh, my goodness. Wow. So you were having visual and tactile experiences, huh?
Yeah, and
wow.
That continues to happen for me. But the tactile experiences were. It felt like a literal demon was behind me. If you could imagine like a really dark. You could even just say that as opposed to demon. I think that can get kind of convoluted, but
yeah.
You could think of there's this dark, heavy presence behind my back and behind my whole body, and it felt like it was entering into my body. So my body felt very dense and dark, and I felt like I was in a hellish realm in a lot of ways.
Wow. So when did you decide to enter the mental health system, Reggie?
So, kind of serendipitous. I hope this isn't too dark to share.
No, please be honest. I mean, it's the experience of so many millions of Americans. It's not too dark for us.
Yeah, I'm very open about it too. So, what kind of coalesced for me, my tipping point was I became convinced that this demon was going to take my body over, and it became very perseverated on stabbing my roommate in the chest with a pair of scissors. And I, was obviously terrified of this. I think I've always been a relatively sweet person. I'm not a violent man. And I think part of me, part of my voice or whatever it is you want to call it, knew that, that would freak me out the most, was, me trying to hurt somebody.
Yeah.
And so I became terrified of this, and I decided that, I'd just run out into the desert and I would just let, wild coyotes eat me alive. And then I came running back because and a half. I was, vomiting and defecating on myself, and for quite a few hours, I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel like, sorry, this might be a little explicit, so if this is hard to hear, I don't want to go too much into the details, but I was ripping veins out of my wrist, and it got really graphic, and it got really intense, and I got really sick right now. I'm dealing with quite the cold going on, and I've taken a couple baths in the last couple days, and for the first time, I was really able to meet that part of me that was dying in that bathtub.
Oh, wow.
Most of the time when I take a bath, I become pretty, I get pretty disoriented by it, and I, need to get out of it. Sometimes it's fine, and I don't even think about that stuff. But yeah, yesterday I was really holding that part of me that was dying in that bathtub, and it was really beautiful, actually.
Oh, Reggie, that's so profoundly intimate as well. It's just like that coming full circle, and here it is, God, 8 years later, and it's the first time that you've been able to say that. Just gives you I think it gives everybody who's suffering at least some willingness to understand the length of time that it takes for people to fully heal or recover, or whatever they want to call it. It's not like, oh yeah, I went into the mental health system and then I was better. It's like, oh no, it's going to take a while. So you ended up, did someone find you in the bathtub and submit you to psychiatric care?
What was interesting about that was my roommate, the one that I was, my voice or whatever was perseverated on, he's the one that found me. Bless his heart. I can't imagine what that was like for him to walk in on that. And then, another friend of mine, Ryan, someone called security, and, he saw me too, and my heart really goes out to him. I haven't talked to either of those people in a very long time, and I don't know.
I want to talk a little bit, Reggie, about what your experience was inpatient. Were you in the Portland inpatient system?
So immediately after that, I was, the ambulance came, and then I was hauled off to Pahrump. It's the first town closest to Death Valley, going east about an hour. And then the next town over is Las Vegas, and that's where I was in my first, mental hospital. And then, I stayed there for about a week, and then I came home to Portland, and, I lost my job, or at least I told them I wasn't coming.
Yeah.
I don't know if I really figured that part out, and then I came back to Portland, and I had the same hospitalizations here, around the same experiences. This time scared about my mother. The voices were freaking me out that way. And I entered the mental health system from there, in Portland.
And did they give you a diagnosis at that point, Reggie?
What's funny about that is this is me telling on myself. Just
yeah, that's honest.
I didn't know my diagnosis until I started working as a peer support specialist, and I looked it up.
Wow.
And no one told me, or at least I was so drugged up that I didn't remember anything. My diagnosis officially was major depression with psychotic features.
Mm-hmm.
I find so interesting about the diagnosis part is, when I'd go see my doctor, he would ask me, are you getting messages from, the TV or the radio? Or are you hearing voices? Are you experiencing, people touching you? And I just, after the second hospitalization, actually, both times, I realized that I needed to lie to get out. I needed to convince them of a particular persona so that I could leave.
Yeah.
And so I did the same thing with my doctor. So I just find it so interesting that, based on, what I tell them, what information I reveal determines a diagnosis, that has a huge impact on, my life. So part of me is really happy that I didn't, but it didn't really.
I think you bring up such an interesting point there, Reggie, that, many people who go through these kind of psychoses or spiritual psychosis or whatever you want to call it are highly, highly intelligent. And so they get their arms around the system pretty quickly, and they understand what they need to say and do pretty efficiently. And so it doesn't really work that we have this punitive system that binds you down in a windowless room, because most people will figure out what to say to get out,
Yeah, and that's what's kind of unfortunate is, a lot of, I think when people get indoctrinated in any type of ideology, and the mental health system is certainly one of those, you have a filter of perception, and and most people see people like myself as somebody that has no cognitive abilities, and ultimately people that are in the hospital, you'd be amazed at the conversations that we're all having.
Yeah, I can only.
We know what's going on.
Yeah.
We're not stupid.
Yeah, undoubtedly. I want to ask about the medication load that you were on. You mentioned in your bio that it made you begin to feel very much not yourself, that the Reggie that you knew, even the one who was suffering, was so far from your reach that you became non-compliant and found some alternative ways of healing. Talk about that process, if you would.
Yeah, sure. I went to Job Corps, and I found this book about medication, and when I was in Job Corps and I was reading that book, it just it had a huge impact on me, and I honestly don't even remember what the book was called, but there's part of me that was always I guess a little anti-med, thought that there was something corrupt about the pharmaceutical industry, and I found it very, I found myself very wary and skeptical about what they were giving me. When I first came back to Portland from Vegas, I remember I had, I think, 4 or 5 different meds I was on, and I stopped taking all of those, and they prescribed me different medications when I was in Portland, and I don't remember what I started on. I know what I ended on, which was Zoloft and risperidone. I'm somebody that's a very artistic type. I play guitar, I play drums, I play bass, I write, and I do hip hop, and I sing. I snowboard, I skateboard, I draw, I paint. I have many hobbies that I really love, and all those things were gone for me.
Yeah.
In that time period. Honestly, I've recently really engaged with my music again, really engaged with my art again, and I think I became, the idea that people had of me, which was, you're mentally ill, you need to get on disability and live in a group home, and that's your life now. And I believed that for a time. I was very fortunate that my mom allowed me to stay at her house for a while. She was concerned about me and wanted me to find work, and that wasn't the right position for me at the time. And I luckily had a friend that their parents let me stay at their little shack during the summer, and I just slept, and I tried to crawl out of a really dark place, and I just kind of laid in bed, and it was the hardest thing to just go walk or something when I was on all those meds. And eventually, they had a time window for me, and they were going to have to, have you move on at this time frame. And I luckily had found a sober living house at that time to live at, and I lived there for about 2.5 years. So in the time frame of being in that house, I think I was on meds for about 2
I think, it's funny, Reggie, is when you talk to the general public and they're like, we don't understand why these people who have these mental health problems don't take these drugs. And I think what's wonderful about what you just did is you really articulate the terrible numbing and the nothingness that a lot of people feel on these. I mean, for a lot of people, they're great and suddenly their moods are balanced and they feel they can go forward. But for, too many people, they're just deadening. They're deadening to the soul. They're deadening to the spirit. They make you gain weight. You feel lethargic. You have cotton mouths. You taste like
and there's
metal.
Also this narrative from the system to just like get over that.
Right. As if that's somehow something that doesn't also matter to people's lives is the quality of their life. It's just like we're keeping this body warm, and so that should be enough. But it's not enough for so many people. So I want to, if you would, just move to how you discovered the Hearing Voices Network and why it works so effectively for you.
So what's odd for me is I ended up going from, patient or whatever you want to call myself, client at LifeWorks Northwest, and then I ended up working at the same clinic I was receiving services at. So I did peer support there for a couple years, and then I found myself kind of bouncing around peer support jobs, wanting to find a place that I felt just comfortable. Unfortunately, in a lot of mental health settings, there's a lot of joking about people's experiences. There's lots of gossip. There's lots of talk that happens behind the doors that's very uncomfortable, and very upsetting for me personally, because they're often joking about experiences that I continue to walk through. And those are the people that are supposed to be, our supposed healers in our community, that are supposed to help people like myself walk through this stuff. So I finally found Folk Time, and I found a lot of people. It's a peer support, agency, so there's a lot of people already in the company, like everyone's a peer, so there's a general understanding, which feels, nice. And that's, what I was looking for a while. And being a peer support, they send us often to Peer Apocalypse, which is a peer support conference that happens every April, typically in Seaside, Oregon. And I was introduced to a Hearing Voices group there by John Harold. He was doing a workshop / Hearing Voices group as one of the breakout rooms, workshops or whatever. And, for me, it was the first time that I heard someone say, I had this demon enter in my body and felt like it was taking me over, and I understood what that meant, and not in this pathologized way, but in this way that was real and deep and intimate. I could hear what she was saying, and for me to relate my experience to her, there was this immediate profound connection.
Yeah.
And there was this my shoulders dropped, and I eased a little bit. I was like, oh my God, what the fuck is this? How did I not hear about this before? I've been at this for a while. I think it was 2 or 3 years into me doing peer support, and I'm just hearing about this whole network that started 30 years ago, just come into the United States in the last decade.
It's so fascinating, Reggie, the power of that, of being seen and heard by someone who can recognize the experience, the depth of the experience that you've had. Many people have said that the techniques that other people have used to gain wellness and a sense of their equilibrium, again, were from these Folk Time meetings and Hearing Voices meetings, and not necessarily from a therapist. Was that also your experience?
I feel like I made some big discoveries recently, and a lot of that has been around that all of my experiences welcomed. It started out very much at war. I was very much at war with myself. And, there came a point where I realized that I was really losing this war, quite poorly. And there became this invitation for me to just welcome. And And it sounds like the most probably backwards thing to present to somebody that was going through what I was going through. But there was, luckily there was this grace and there was this willingness to listen to what, another voices like love was trying to tell me. And I started to really work with stopping, fighting my voices, and I started to just really be with, the voices. If you could probably imagine the worst thing that your mind could create, that's what my mind or my voices were doing 24/7.
Right.
And I often say a mantra to myself. I would say humble, patient, fearless. I don't know why I chose those words, but I did. And yeah, so that became like this huge catalyst for me, and continues to be, is that everything is welcomed in myself, and there's nothing to run from, and that becomes a reflection of my outside world. That like everyone that's coming into my world is welcomed, and I don't have to reject them. And I think that that's what's so powerful about the Hearing Voices groups is everyone's experience is really welcome to be here.
Yeah.
And there's nothing. And that's like oddly the most liberating thing, because this world tells you you can't have that experience. We're going to lock you up and drug you if you do. But we're there to say you can have that experience, and hey, what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
Like, what's the richness of it even?
Did you also find, Reggie, that the more you accepted the voices, the less you heard from the really threatening ones?
I would say it's even more deep than accepting. I like the word accepting, but I would say like fully like embracing, like welcoming in.
Wow.
Like saying, hey, you are completely allowed to be here. Like the voice that wants to stab my roommate, like you're allowed to be here. Like, I'm sorry you're so upset. I dealt with a lot of domestic violence in my house. I remember part of being in the Hearing Voices in the groups I facilitate for right now has provided me with a wealth of people's experiences and a vast range of different perspectives, and it's really helped me to navigate a lot of my own stuff. To be perfectly honest, I feel like the groups have have healed me in so many different ways. And there's this. Oh, geez, I'm losing my train of thought. No.
But where we were was we were talking about, have you had the experience of being visited or bothered by those dark voices more often because of your willingness to sort of allow them in?
Yeah, and like I was describing earlier, I dealt with a lot of domestic violence, and there was this image from my childhood of someone holding a knife and charging somebody with it.
Oh, geez.
And that image actually presented itself in a couple different ways, and what I mean by that is, that happened a couple different times. And to make that connection, for me, was like so revelatory to see that, why was this voice so fixated on this like homicidal, fixation, and to make that connection that, it's very much related to my trauma.
Right.
Holy shit.
Yeah, no doubt.
That was like so liberating.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I have to say, I just am so frustrated in some ways that more people who are, especially those who are experiencing first-time psychosis, have never heard of Hearing Voices, that it's a relatively small network of people who know so much about the healing ability. And I really wish you luck, Reggie, on expanding the network and letting more people know about it, because it's a tremendous, tremendous program. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much. Could I end on something?
Yeah,
quick?
Please.
So I just went to the World Hearing Voices Congress, and there was, lots of great energy going into that conference and Congress, and I guess my reflection from it all was that the solution for me seems to be glaringly obvious. Like, people, I guess this is my own perception, but people go mad via separation, meaning that we go mad because our disconnections with life and with those in our community. the obvious solution in my head is that we need connection. So I say, let's connect.
Yeah, I love that. Oh, man, it's been so great to talk with you, Reggie. And if you enjoyed this conversation and you want to learn more about any of the things we talked about today, you can click on the link for the Foundation for Excellence in Mental Health Care and become a sustaining member. Reggie, what a pleasure and an honor to have this conversation with you. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.